Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation of Naive Realism or Virtual Realism. Either, both, or neither. I hope you enjoyed the intro, and I hope that it helped to set the stage for what we are about to discuss, and that is, what can we really know? Is it possible to know that we know anything? Is it possible to know that we don't know anything? Is our perception of the world an accurate representation, or merely the construction of our own mind and faculties? Will Brad and Angelina ever get back together? These are the fundamental questions of epistemology that the lover of wisdom must answer if he is to begin to make a claim about anything. I wanted to present two epistemological thoughts today and stack them up side by side, and see if we can make any sense out of the world around us. Today we will be exploring the differences between naive realism and virtual realism. The first, naive realism, is not to be confused with viewing the world as a general nitwit, and the second, virtual realism, is not to be confused with your avatar from World of Warcraft. Both points of view try to explain the phenomena of our senses perceiving the world around us, without resorting to full-blown phenomenology. Phenomenology says that we can't know what reality is. We can only know the mere phenomenon that is produced by our senses. But that is a topic for another day. For now, let us focus on these branches of epistemology that intend to prove immediate realism. Perhaps the most important thing to start with would be the central problem of epistemology. Perhaps you might remember the famous unknown unknowns dilemma presented by then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in 2002. For those of you who are either too young to remember, or just simply not a giant political nerd, the exact quote goes like this. Rumsfeld stated, "There are known knowns. These are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things that we don't know we don't know." He was trying to explain the slow search and discovery of WMDs in Iraq after a year of fighting. Little did he know that he was setting the stage for the greatest epistemological presentation of all time. And in case you were confused, that would be this presentation, of course. Rumsfeld makes a critical truth claim to know something. I think it is fair to say that the philosopher giant Plato would have never questioned his own senses' ability to deliver reality. In fact, if you were to study his theory of forms, you would see that Plato's epistemology is more concerned with the universal concept of ethics and the reality of virtues. Abstractions, of course, but where do they come from? We perceive the world through our senses. As such, there's no way to get outside of our senses. Therefore, if we question our senses' ability to deliver real information about the world, or the perception of this thing that we call the reality around us, then what could possibly be the answer to what reality actually is? What experiment could be done that can prove our senses to be true? After all, our senses would have to verify the data. This impasse stands at the heart of epistemological discussion. The field of epistemology, unlike in Plato's day, is a proverbial minefield of these conundrums and dilemmas. It reminds me of something else very prevalent in our society today, but we will draw this connection later. First, let's make sure that we know what we're talking about. Naive realism is the common sense theory of perception. It is also known as direct realism or common sense realism. Naive realism holds that the view of the world that we derive from our senses is to be taken at face value. Ergo, if I see a chair in front of me, well then, yep, it's a chair. It is an objective reality outside of my senses, which my senses are perceiving accurately, and my mind is delivering to me an accurate picture of what is really out there. End of discussion. Problems with naive realism. Although adhering strictly to naive realism would be very convenient and make epistemology far less mysterious, the reasonable observer can see that there are some glaring problems within the concept of naively accepting reality exactly as we perceive it. The most obvious is the fact that people perceive things differently. People can and do create scenarios or images that are purposely designed to lead our perceiving senses astray. The classic clinical example is the Ames room, which makes these two people look drastically different in size, although they are in fact the same height. When you realize that you are looking into a room designed specifically to deceive your senses, you realize that you can't always trust what you see. The more practical example would be a politician who uses rhetoric explicitly to craft an image of what he is trying to do, and saying that what he is trying to accomplish are, quote, good things. Or perhaps the straight-laced coworker whom you never knew had a drug problem until he was arrested at work. Ouch. Even innocently, people still can look at the exact same thing and perceive two different realities. For instance, police detectives constantly complain that eyewitness accounts are notoriously conflicting when multiple witnesses have witnessed the exact same event. Okay, so that's naive realism. Imperfect for every scenario, but certainly not without its practicality. Now let's take a look at virtual realism. Virtual realism does not stand in direct opposition to naive realism, but in slight contrast, because it is stating that what is perceived by the senses is only virtually there and not there in a real sense. For example, the brownness of the chair is virtually real as long as the chair is being perceived as brown. But when we're not looking at the chair, the brownness no longer exists as a part of the chair's reality. It is worth stopping to note that virtual realism is still an attempt at explaining immediate realism. I make several matrix jokes throughout the presentation, so please forgive me for that. But I want to clarify that virtual realism is not the complete virtual reality of sci-fi lore. It is not trying to prove that there is nothing in front of our perception aside from our ideas of reality. It is still trying to be a thesis for immediate realism. That is to say that there is a reality out there that our senses are perceiving. It is just merely trying to answer the question as to why two people viewing a very real object might perceive it quite differently. Still, as stated by Kenneth Gallagher in his epistemological work, The Philosophy of Knowledge, virtual realism ultimately makes the claim that reality is a very barren place when it is not being perceived, and means that much of what we think the world is merely a phantom of our perceptions. So we know that naive realism isn't perfect, and neither is virtual realism. It makes the determination of primary and secondary qualities by virtue of declaring certain qualities are indeed subjective, and therefore secondary. The primary qualities that are implied by qualifying secondary qualities is in itself an unverifiable truth claim. It is also very legitimate to question the premise. If our senses can be deceived about secondary qualities, how do we know that our senses are not being deceived on the primary ones? Now, it might be counter-argued that this is not a fair argument, since we cannot remove ourselves from our own senses and our own perceptions, so that this cannot be definitively researched and answered. But whoever starts here has already answered the definitive status of the spatial object before he is able to even ask the question. In logic, we would call this the fallacy of begging the question, the same trap which Descartes fell into in his famous saying, "I think, therefore I am." As Kraft points out in his book Socratic Logic, what Descartes wants to prove is that he exists, that there is an I. But he assumes that there exists this I behind the thinking and puts it into his premise. If you are still unclear on this dilemma, perhaps the ridiculous might help us better understand. Kraft gives us this other example that is a little bit easier to see. The example is, you can't help believing in free will. You're predestined to think that way. So if I can only perceive things through my senses, and that perception can be deceived, or otherwise not relied upon to make a definitive determination, then how do I know that my senses are not being deceived regarding the spatial reality or the primary quality? What if I perceive a chair, but it's really a beluga whale? Highly unlikely, but hey, if I can't rule it out, then what can I really say about the reality which I claim is immediately there? As I said toward the beginning of the presentation, the epistemological dilemma that we are discussing reminds me of a very similar dilemma in our modern culture. Now, I want to reiterate the epistemological problem of perception, and I want to do that with this passage from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The Stanford Encyclopedia says that the central problem in the epistemology of perception is that of explaining how perception could give us knowledge or justified belief about an external world, about things outside of ourselves. This problem has traditionally been viewed in terms of a skeptical argument that purports to show that such knowledge and justification are impossible. Two main types of response to the skeptical argument have traditionally been given: a metaphysical response and a more directly epistemological response that focuses on principles specifying what is required for knowledge and/or justification. Now, I know that is a long definition, but it is necessary in understanding the proper response to healthy epistemological skepticism. Because ultimately, when we are talking about the essence of reality, of course within the context of our ability to know it, we're basically standing at the outer limits of our abilities and attempting to explain that which is just beyond our grasp. This is where the road forks, and we must either go one of two ways. We must form a metaphysical premise, that is to say, that there is a reality beyond the immediately physical one that would account for the types of realities that our senses can perceive. And if we don't want to go down this road, we'll have to go down the other fork, which is to try to discover a natural solution. Now, the skeptic might say that the first is a dismissal of reality, but the latter is certainly a denial of sanity, because it accepts the premise of going back to the same unverifiable facts and trying to exact a different and definitive outcome. I am paraphrasing, of course, the famous idiom, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Skepticism is a healthy tool, but it is not an end in and of itself. Being the absence of knowledge, it might be more comparable to an abstraction such as darkness or hunger. I say it is a healthy tool because we should never take anything at face value. After all, our senses can be deceived, right? But to ascribe to pure skepticism as a life philosophy is fatalism, pure and simple. You are an accident, I am an accident. The accidents of language make us think that we're having a rational conversation, but really, it is just lost in our perceptions and has no real basis. Nothing is definable. All thought is nothing more than nominalism. We simply call this existing, but this meaningless existence cannot be proven. We call it life, but we live for nothing, we die for nothing, and no action of ours could possibly be applied, verified, or proven to have any impact on existence. And I can't even begin to describe my actions as right or wrong, good or bad, lasting or temporary. Wow, and we thought that virtual realism looked bleak. You know, when you're not looking at it. As a school of thought, skepticism denies the ability of humanity to know something, one of the most rudimentary parts of the human mind. Now, skepticism, as stated before, is a tool, but it should be used to get at the truth. But it can never deliver the truth. So, is pure skepticism an accurate way to view the world? The answer is no. Because to be a pure skeptic, one would have to contradict himself. The person who says that they do not know anything is ipso facto saying that they know one thing, and that is the fact that they don't know anything. St. Augustine wisely reasons, "If you are deceived, you must exist. But you say you are deceived, therefore you can be certain you exist. But if you can be certain you exist, you can be certain of something. And if you can be certain of something, you are no longer a skeptic." The implied obverse of skepticism is absolutism. If the universe is not a giant cosmic joke with man's thinking mind as the punchline, then it must be true that the mind knows, that it exists in a knowable state, which we call reality, and that it can develop knowledge, no matter how abstract, and form an accurate picture of reality. The mind is not a jar in a vat, but rather an active and perceiving entity that takes reality and turns it into abstract thought for the sake of gaining wisdom. Now, this might be called the commonsensical approach, but the fact that your mind can formulate a counterargument is only further proof that man knows something. Absolutism leads to universal realities, but ultimately, to be really true, it has to lead back to a single, universal reality, which is the source of all other realities. There has to be one truth upon which the truths of the world are founded. For if there are equal competing ideologies about the world, then there will have to be an authority by which they can be judged. It should come as no surprise that classical philosophy came to this conclusion not by faith, but by reason and philosophy. In fact, Aristotle would begin the discussion about the singular uncaused cause that beget the universe, an Aristotelian phrase which would be further expounded upon by Aquinas in his Summa. This is the metaphysical approach, the one that has been adopted as the rational answer to the question of where knowledge comes from. Skepticism as a competing ideology has always been the adversary to this approach, and its popularity rises and falls with the intellectual integrity by which absolutism is held from age to age. For example, a healthy skepticism, but still a deep intellectual look at absolutism, free from superstition, begets some of the greatest philosophical thought of the 13th century in Thomas Aquinas and John Duns Scotus. Compare that with today's society, where intellectual absolutism is almost non-existent, and we have witnessed the rise of militant atheism, scientism, and a complete rejection of absolutism. So far, we have been discussing the objective or subjective reality of concrete objects. I mean, if there are such things. But as you can see, the only way that we can answer that question is through the interpretive lens of our senses and how they perceive the object. Speaking about reality as a reality thus becomes an abstraction, so that to understand the concrete, we are reduced to understanding it in the abstract. But just because we understand the object in an abstract way, does this make the object not real? And thus we draw the connection between these ideologies, attempting to understand our perception of concrete realities, with the modern cultural problem today, which is our modern conception of a very important abstract reality: morality. Today, in America anyway, modern progressives, going by the newly coined term social justice warrior, SJW for short, certainly speak the language of morality. That's not fair. That's not right. That's not equal. But again, we cannot subjectively speak about actions as being right or wrong in an arbitrary sense. Morality can't be reduced to merely the culturally acceptable, just like legalizing slavery didn't make it right in pre-1865 America. Relativism says that there are no truths, that the truth is simply what you make it. But again, this implies that there is one truth, and that truth is that there are no truths. This one has logical fallacy written all over it. The same dilemma is at work in the SJW's ideology, where the rules apply to some universals, but not all. For example, an SJW supports the dignity of all human persons, except of course those who are unborn. The SJW also fights for equality for all, but only in economic terms. And the SJW wants unmitigated access to wealth and services, but does not want to invoke the responsibility on people to help provide for them. This microcosm of activism that pushes for a moral founded on subjective terms is no different than assuming that any or all of our sense perception can be defined in subjective terms. But it is also a great illustration that we cannot view our morals and moral formation with naivety, nor can we reduce our sense perception this way either. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living, and this must directly apply to both the person unwilling to form their conscience to the absolute moral truth which governs all men, and also the man who would refuse to understand the world around him by constant examination and discovery. Socrates was deeply concerned with virtue and saw it as a reality deeper and even more real than any concrete thing. He believed this not because he was a religious fanatic or a superstitious ideologue. He did so precisely because he recognized that this abstraction was the one thing that people could not escape, because just as much as it was out there somewhere, it was also inside our own heads. He might have also argued that it was more closely attached to our own hearts from where it generated. As we discuss the abstract concept of a reality out there and try to determine if it really is, we might do well to remember that the reality is also inside our own heads, and we are obliged to form what is in our heads to the universal reality which is around us, and not the other way around. To do so is an alternative that is much scarier than you might think. So how do we make sense of the world around us? And which is correct, naive or virtual realism? The answer is both are useful perceptual ideologies of how we are to sense, interpret, and judge the objective reality which is around us. And the answer is also neither, because they are not acceptable ends in and of themselves. If you follow either, they will do one of two things: leave your life so undiscovered that it is not worth living, as Socrates would say, or you would find yourself in a sea of subjectivity in which you have thrown all of your tools overboard and abandoned the mental capacity that would allow you to escape. Getting lost in our heads and insisting on staying there is an option, but this is a slippery slope, one without a reasonable philosophical stopgap other than absolute fatalism. What I mean to say is, there isn't a convenient and reasonable point on the sliding scale of subjectivity where we can say, here, this is the point at which reality is real, and the rest is just merely perception. We must rely on the only interpretive lens we have, our senses, to be a proper guiding light to the reality around us. It is a perception that recognizes both concrete realities and abstractions, and it is also one that has the ability to view both in the same reality. It is a mystery even to the wisest, and the answer is unknowable as long as we are on this side of our senses. But lastly, we must also constantly improve that understanding by using the tool of skepticism in a healthy and objective way, rather than a relative and dismissive way. It is equally dangerous to say, yep, that's what it is, and I'm never going to question it. So now we've come full circle and back to the question: is it possible to know anything? As we have found out, it depends on what the definition of each of these words are. But it depends even more on the concept that words can be defined. Absolutism relies on a metaphysical explanation, but it seems the only way off the hamster wheel of trying to explain objective reality through subjective lenses. When we try to define the essence of sense, perception, and judgment, we will quickly find that what would go into an essential definition of one of these terms would necessarily overlap with the other, because the mind seamlessly works to make sense of the world through this process. Because of that, it is hard to say where one begins and the other ends along the path. When we back up to the moment right before we sense something, we are literally outside of ourselves. Now, can we say in any definitive sense that this abstraction is a reality? No, we cannot. But reason can take us there, if we are unafraid of following the truth wherever it leads. And if we are not, we will forever be doomed to be led around by our own conclusions. So don't listen to Morpheus, especially if the next time you see him, he presents a virtual realism conundrum.